Welcome back to another episode of Demystifying Self-Publishing. I'm your host, Alyssa, and today we are chatting with Richard Lowy, who is one of our authors. He has published Kalman and Leopold and is receiving incredible acclaim across a variety of different mediums. Richard, thank you so much for being here today. I would love if you could kick the episode off just by chatting a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here, and what a pleasure to have this opportunity. About myself, I'm born and raised in Vancouver, Canada, and I had a normal upbringing, went to the high school, and I joined a band with friends and a Jewish community, and it was what I thought was a normal upbringing. And it wasn't till later in my life that I started discovering that my father was this survivor. And I didn't know what that meant. And then he was part of the Holocaust. And then it was, he survived Auschwitz. And then he was a Mengele twin. Well, back in high school in the 70s and the 80s, you didn't have the internet. You didn't have Google. And so if you wanted to figure that kind of stuff out, you had to go to a library. You had to go through big, thick books of historical background information, and I would rather be playing with my friends in the band. And so I didn't really know what any of that was until I got later, and then I started getting interested in my father's history, our family history. I started finding out a little more about the Holocaust and this word Auschwitz, which again, a lot of people didn't know what that was. And it really turned into this curiosity that my father never talked about it. And what was interesting is that we had all of these relatives, our uncles and aunts. They weren't our uncles and aunts by blood. So they were our uncles and aunts through this connection that they were also survivors. Right. And through that, they came to Canada. They had lost all their families, but they formed this unity and they built their families together. So we all became these relatives of uncles and aunts. So it was a really interesting, discovery, understanding that you're not blood related to us, but we're calling you uncle and auntie. Right. And so as we grew up, I found out a little more. And then in discussions with a friend of mine, Shel Piercy, who was a film director, he made a number of documentaries. And I told him my family story, my father, that I wanted to make a documentary. And he agreed. He said, we can make a documentary on this. And that was the creation of Leo's Journey, the story of the Mengele twin. And we made that in 2000. We got a broadcast deal in Canada, parts of Europe, and Israel. And we were very, very fortunate to have Christopher Plummer narrate Leo's Journey, which was a very big deal. And it was an honor to have him tell this story because he did it so beautifully and so engaging. So if you do get a chance to watch Leo's Journey, you can do that at our website at Kalman and Leopold.
Absolutely.
So the film got broadcast in Canada, parts of Europe, and Israel. And I thought at that point, I'd done my duty as a child of a survivor. I told my father's story. We got it out to the world, and I thought, okay, this is great. It then turned out that when it showed in Israel, a man happened to watch the film, and as he was watching the film, he saw a picture of my father as a young boy, and he started pointing at the screen. He goes, "It's my Lipa. It's my Lipa." And he calls to his wife, and his wife comes in, and, the picture of my father had gone away. And then it was like a matter of him saying, wait. And then at the end of the film, we showed my father again, a picture of him as a young boy. And he says, "There, that's my Lipa." It turns out he'd been searching for my father for 56 years because my father helped protect him in the SS guard shack inside of Mengele's hospital camp, which was news to us. So this man reached out, got in touch with my father, and then I was over for dinner a couple of weeks later, and my mom mentioned to me that, someone from the camp called Dad. And I went, "Someone from the camp?" And I'm thinking like Camp Atikva, Camp Mary, like the different camps that I went to as a kid. I mean, it's like I wasn't thinking Holocaust, concentration camp.
Absolutely.
I was just somebody from the camp. And so I said, "Well, who was this person?" And they showed me an email that he had sent to Dad. And by this time, Dad had a little bit of early onset dementia, so he was a little more confused about who this guy was and didn't kind of remember him. And so I got in touch with Kalman, this man, and he starts telling me stories about Dad and how he had met him and how they worked in the SS Guard Shack, which Dad never spoke about. And we flew him to Vancouver. We reconnected the two of them. And in interviews, Kalman is telling the story of my father and himself, and Dad would pipe up, "Oh yeah, he was a real bastard. I remember we used to be up at 5 o'clock in the morning and we'd have to go clean their boots and they would beat us." And I'm going, "You never spoke of being in the SS Guard Shack." And for my father, his whole protection mechanism was to stay invisible. He didn't want to know anybody. He didn't want to meet anybody. He didn't want to befriend anybody, because if you befriended somebody and then the next day they end up on the pile, on the heap of bodies. So you don't want to be emotionally engaged with people. And he started remembering all these things. And the two of them were like these two little boys in front of me. And you could see they were like 72, 74 years old, but now they're 14 and 16 years old, reverting to kibitzing and playfulness between each other. You know, the little joking back and forth. "Oh, you remember this? Oh, yeah, like this." And you're watching this unfold in front of you. And so after that, I recorded all this information. Dad passed away 6 months later. So it was very, serendipitous that we were able to connect the two of them before Dad passed away. I mean, imagine the history lost.
Absolutely.
And after Dad passed, I went to Israel and I got this man's full story from like birth all the way to pass, to his present day. And we hit it off. He was so genuine and informative and detailed, and going into the little minutia of every day, minutes, moments, fears, horror, moments of happiness, moments of humor inside of Auschwitz. And so I recorded all of that. I came back to Vancouver and I literally, I called a few people saying, "Hey, I've got this information and like this would make a great book or it would make a documentary," and nobody was interested. And I started getting busy with work. So I had to get back to my job. I was a corporate event producer. I produced international show production around the world. I've worked with Andrea Bocelli, Harry Connick Jr., Diana Krall, Van Morrison, the Doobie Brothers, producing shows in Russia, Portugal, Mexico, Hawaii. That was my background.
Right.
Creating multimedia shows and productions. And so I got back to my craft and my work, and 18 years went by, and then COVID hit. And when COVID hit, I ended up, like everybody else in the world, sequestering into the house. And I came down to my studio and I started cleaning up. And I found the hard drives that I had recorded all of this video footage of Dad and Kalman. And I started going through it and I started going, well, maybe I'll cut a documentary together and edit some of this together and get it out. And so the first step to do that was to transcribe it. And as I started transcribing the pages of the information, it's so different that when you read something, you're in their head. You become part of the moment with them. When you're watching something or someone's telling you something, it's one thing. But when they're telling their story and you're reading it, it's in your head and you're walking in their shoes, you're seeing what they saw, you're feeling what they felt.
Right.
And so as I started getting more into it, I thought, this is something special, because never before have I read a story about the day-to-day operations of the guard shack of inside Mengeles hospital camp, in the laboratories. There's less than a handful, maybe 5 other books in the world that have this perspective of being in the situation, and none that were inside an SS guard shack with the guards. You would never be allowed to stand within 3 feet of a guard.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
as he's beating someone or killing someone else, and just stand there and watch what's going on.
It's
right.
No wonder the horrors led to either an intentional or defensive blocking for your father in terms of later in life, and having this moment of reconnection where in conversation these memories start to come out again, or maybe the comfort of being in the company of somebody that you went through all of these horrific atrocities with allows for you to maybe actually process some of those terrors that you were unable to at the time that it was happening.
Nobody can understand if you are in a situation that is a traumatic. If there's a bank robbery and you're in the bank with this other person and you're sharing this horrific moment of somebody threatening your life and you're together, no one's going to understand what you went through except that other person.
Absolutely.
Especially the fact that you two are together, you're talking about it, you're talking about what we should do next. Right. So as they're in the SS guard shack and things are happening, my dad will grab Kalman. He says, come. And they follow outside and they watch. And, so there's things happening and they form this bond. Originally, it was interesting because my dad did not want to be his friend. They were picked out of a lineup one morning outside of the SS barrack 14, where Mengele kept all of his twins and his dwarfs. An SS officer walked down the line, picked these two boys. They're totally unrelated. Both have twin sisters, both taken for the expense of Mengele. That morning, they're standing in line. SS guard walks down, picks one boy out of the line, picks another boy out of the line, takes them outside the electrified gates into the SS guard shack. As they're walking outside, Kalman turns to my father and he says, where are we going? Father goes like
he's the tour guide. Like he knows.
It's like he knows. No, he has no clue. And my father looks at this other boy and he's going like, Kalman is a naive yeshiva booker. A yeshiva booker is a religious boy. All he did is from the time he could read, he went to religious school. He studied the Torah. He studied the Bible. He didn't listen to radio. He didn't read newspapers. He didn't know what a Nazi was. He knew nothing. My father was a mischievous little boy that would be out on the streets playing soccer during the day and working a part-time job in the barrel factory down the road for his friend. He saw the gendarme and the Iron Cross as the anti-Semitism was building in Hungary, originally Czechoslovakia, then taken by Hungary. So he could see what was going on. He saw the Germans coming in. He felt the rise of the anti-Semitism out in the streets. And so he knew what was going on. And so when he was in Auschwitz, he was very aware of what was happening. He was always looking around. And Kalman was just kind of like, what's going on? He had no idea. Right. My father felt that this other boy would draw attention to him and could possibly get him into trouble and attract the attention of the guards.
Right.
He felt responsible now to take care of this kid. So the character arc of my father and Kalman changed from the moment they met to now spending in the time being responsible to take care of this kid and then forming this relationship. And so many things happened to them that Kalman almost did get them killed. Right? You'll read about a Christmas party where Kalman is peeking in through a room and he sees a naked SS female guard making out with Fritzy Fritz, one of the other SS guards who's brutal. And my dad grabs him and says, you idiot, what are you doing?
Right.
You're going to get us beaten or killed or something, right? If Fritz catches you, right? And so he grabs him. And then there's another Christmas party. I'm not going to tell you about what happens there, but the guy pulls out his Mauser and he starts shooting. And it's just this moment of terror for these two boys. And so it's all of these stories that started, coming out. And father just chose to, the whole Holocaust, he told his story to the Shoah Foundation, which is Steven Spielberg. And from that point on, he started having sweats. He started having nightmares. And my mother said, you've done it. You've told your story. You don't need to talk about it anymore.
Right.
That generation grew up saying, we don't want to give the horror of what we went through to our children. Absolutely. So they never told us.
That for me is very reminiscent of my grandmother. She grew up in Holland and her home was right near the front lines. The American Red Cross came and took over her home. And these were things that we didn't learn about until she was well into her 80s. We knew exactly her family had eventually immigrated to Canada, but we knew none of the horrors that were experienced. And my grandfather was a POW who escaped. And there are just so many things, I think, that would, as you mentioned, be lost had the time to have these conversations and the willingness to maybe dig a little bit deeper, not been present from people like yourselves. Like, if you think about all of the unimaginable terror and lessons that the world could really benefit to know and not replicate in the future. I mean,
You mean the present day? Forget the future. Forget the future. It's happening now. It's happening now.
It's
it's when I read the testimony and I read about Ottmar von Verschuur. Do you know who Ottmar von Verschuur is?
No.
No. You know who Joseph Mengele is?
Yes.
Okay, so he was the doctor on the ramp inside Auschwitz-Birkenau, taking the twins off of the ramp for his human experiment studies. Okay,
right.
There's this heinous, evil doctor. Okay, well, Ottmar von Verschuur was Mengele's professor at the Frankfurt University, and he indoctrinated his student into his belief system that the Jews were less, they were subhuman, that they should be used for the twin experiments, and that through his indoctrination as a university professor to his students, this type of rhetoric was going on. And then Ottmar von Verschuur was the guy that put Mengele inside Auschwitz. Now, there's controversial information. Did he put him in? Did he recommend him? Did Mengele want to go in himself? At the very end of the day, Ottmar von Verschuur and Mengele were very close. And Mengele ended up inside Auschwitz-Birkenau doing twin experiments. His thesis was based on doing this in Ottmar von Verschuur's classes. This is where it originated. So if we talk about today, and we talk about the campuses and what's happening with the university professors having their belief systems, indoctrinating students, to me, you go to school to learn how to think.
Yes.
You go to school to learn about having critical thinking so you can make your own decisions. When a professor that, has his own belief systems and starts pushing those onto the students, then that's when we have to take a step back and go, why are we sending our children to these schools?
Right.
Then you have to pick the school of the politics that you like.
Right.
Do I want my kid going to a Republican school or a Democratic school? Do I want my kid going to a racist white school? Do I want my kid going to a school that's going to teach about religious fanaticism?
Right. I mean, we're in Canada and I have young children and they're not yet school age, but thinking about the trajectory of when they do enter school, what does that look like? Are they entering the public school system? Are they entering the Catholic school system? Are they entering a private school system? And each of them has its own downfalls. Each of them has its own curriculums. And I think we used to be able to feel confident about the fact that a child was going to learn, they were going to learn kind of information that was just factual information and receive that and go on and then have the opportunity to become a critical thinker and apply that in the world. And I don't think we have the same confidence in the role that the education system plays in 2025.
Exactly. And so when you're reading the book, you're kind of taking 1935, 36, 1937, 1938, and you're going, the politics of today and the rhetoric of today and the misinformation of today. The Nazis provided radios to each of the German households, and they only broadcast their policies, their politics, their belief systems, their films in the theaters. So they're indoctrinating the entire population into their way of thinking. Well, if you follow certain TV channels, you're going to follow what those commentators are saying. Absolutely. Right, what those pundits are saying. It was interesting because way back in the day, news used to be, this is the way it is. That was Walter Cronkite. When he used to sign off, Walter Cronkite was a very famous broadcaster. The world watched Walter Cronkite. And when he went to Vietnam and he went into the back villages and he saw what was happening, it was the first time he came back, he did his broadcast, and at the end of his broadcast, instead of just reporting the news and saying, this is the way it happened, there was a fire, this is what happened, this is what happened today, you make your own conclusions. He did not have an opinion. After coming back from Vietnam, at the very end of his broadcast, he gave an opinion. And the opinion was that we can't win this war. and that we shouldn't be in this war. So this was the first time on a news broadcast that it was an opinion. Right. And today, when you're watching TV, for the most part, all you're getting is opinions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we are heading into an election in our country, and I think we're in a very divisive environment right now.
Yes.
I think, we saw that happen through COVID. It was really quite emphasized and apparent throughout that time, and has only kind of continued on the heels of the pandemic, and with our friends in the South and some of what's happening there. We're now in a really difficult time where there is a lot of information, but it's not all factual information.
Misinformation. So you're in a situation where somebody said to me the other day, oh, the conservative leader he's anti-abortion. Mm-hmm. And so I looked it up, I did my research, and I said, well, actually, no, he's not. Right. So you're sitting here and going, it depends what you read. Mm-hmm. It depends on, if I'm following a liberal site, they're going to be promoting the liberals and all the misinformation that they've heard, which is, oh, that's news now. You need to do your own research, and we have not been groomed in this generation to do research. We're a TikTok generation where we live on sound bites. We
instant gratification.
We scroll through and go, I like that, I like this. That's how we get our information. So we don't know what's going on. And it's the dumbing down of the society in general, which is what happened back in the 30s in that time period. So when you look at the brown shirts of Nazi Germany, it was the 18 to 25-year-old unemployed males that were angry. And that was where Hitler went, and he motivated those people, and he got them angrier, and he got them angrier until he motivated them to start taking action and to standing up. And so you go to this opportunity of people that are going to listen to you. It doesn't matter what you're saying. This is what's happening. And it's happening everywhere. It's not just happening in Canada, it's happening in the world. And, it's a crazy time. But what was really interesting in writing the book is that as I'm following the narrative of what was going on with these different countries, it started becoming eerily similar to what we're seeing today.
Right.
And it was just fascinating because what I did in the book, it wasn't just, I took Kalman and Leopold's story, and that is an accurate accounting of, I wasn't reimagining history.
Right.
I was responsible in respecting it, ensuring accuracy and personal memory. I had to cross-reference all the details with the Holocaust museums, the historians, the archives, to try and dig down and say, okay, well, Dad said this and Kalman said that. What was happening at the 30,000 foot level?
Right.
What was happening, in Germany at that time to give context to what they were saying. So you read it in the sense of it's a very personal story about these two boys, the 14, 16-year-old boys, and what they went through. But then in the footnotes, you're able to get the historical accuracy of what was happening that verify what they said, even though as a 14, 16-year-old boy didn't understand the complexities of Nazi Germany, the war machine, the propaganda of what was going on. In the background, we're able to understand what was happening during that time. And that, I think, is why this book is being seen not only as historically accurate, it's been verified by a number of historians and museums. All of the video footage from Kalman and Leopold now is archived at the museum. Wow. Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Because this is a historical, factual story. It's different than a novelization or a dramatization. So, for instance, they're not going to take a book that is based on a true story. They can't archive that in the museums because it's based on a true story, which means it's novelized or dramatized certain situations. Kalman had made it very clear to me. He said, Richard, you do not need to dramatize this. It was drama enough.
I can only imagine.
And the painstaking detail that I went through to ensure that their voices were protected in what they were saying. Whether they were right or wrong, whether they misunderstood a situation, it didn't matter. This is what they thought at that moment. This is what they saw at that moment. And it was really important to me that they didn't give away anything about the future. So, for instance, I'm interviewing a 72 and 74-year-old man. Yes. And they're saying, well, Nazi Germany was doing this at the time and that. And I'm going, that's interesting information. But what was happening to you on that day? Yes. What happened to you on that day? And so as they walk through what happened on the day, we as the reader follow them in their footsteps. We don't know what's about to happen next. We have no idea. So you're in the moment with them, which makes it really interesting. So what happens is the historians and the museums go, historically, this is an important book. But on the young reader side, if you're 14, 16 years old, it's told through the voice of a 14, 16-year-old, so it's easy to understand and read. It's very similar to Anne Frank. Right. It's the perspective of a young person. So it's an easy book to read. And the young people relate to these two young boys. So it's hitting on both sides.
Absolutely. I can only imagine the gravity of not only sitting down and facilitating this conversation between these two men at the time, but also the gravity of hearing that information from your father after not being familiar with everything that he had experienced. What was it like to receive that information and be able to process it or distance yourself from it enough to be able to turn it into the book that it is today?
It was interesting because I got a lot of my father's story from Leo's journey. When we made Leo's journey, we learned father's story. And it was going through in the footage in the background and going to Auschwitz. And so after you're involved, you start to become a little numb to it. Like if you show me a graphic picture of the Holocaust, etc., I will look at that and go, okay, I'm not emotionally, overwhelmed by the graphicness of it. Right. Whereas when I started, it was extremely hard to look at some of these images, to know that these people weren't alive. One of the hardest things I had to do is that when I was doing the images within the book, I would tell the story and then I would edit these images.
Yeah.
And what was happening is that as I was going through and editing the images, I was having to cut certain people out as I wanted to zoom in and focus, because most of the images were these very large, with lots of information in them. And I'm seeing the boy and his mother and the fear in his eye. So I would cut out and I would zoom in because I wanted to show that aspect of what was going on so you could feel the emotion coming off the page. Right. As I was cutting out all those other people, I felt like I was removing them from their opportunity to still be in existence. And that was sometimes hard because you're looking at the faces of these people. So I thought that was very traumatic. But I assumed this role as of an interpreter. I basically looked at this as I wasn't narrating a story. I was shaping these powerful memories into a cohesive, accessible story. Right. And my responsibility was to keep their voices intact and to make sure that I edited for clarity, for flow. I never intended to alter anything. There were times when I looked at it and I thought, you know what? If I just did this, it would make it that much more interesting. There was a great story in there about how one of Mengele's nemesis had come into the barrack and taken a bunch of twins, and they were going to send them to the gas chambers. And this other twin, Zvi Spiegel, who was this older boy who was responsible to look out for the younger twins, and he broke away, got out of the barrack, ran to the guard shack, and demanded that they called Mengele. And for a Jew to run to an SS guard shack and tell a guard to do something, right. First of all, you're running in an area you shouldn't be running. Second, you're telling a guard to do something, which is unheard of. And they got Mengele on the phone. Mengele came down and he stopped. This other doctor was he knew what he was doing by trying to kill some of Mengele's twins. He just wanted to, stick it to Mengele, right? Because these two guys are butting heads. And so it was a great story. However, Kalman and Leopold never saw that because they were in the guard shack in the back on that day doing their work. They didn't see him coming up. They never talked about that. They never said anything about it. So even though I had written it and I historically researched it, I'm thinking, this is a great story. I ended up cutting it. Right.
So that responsibility that you took through the process of writing the book, I imagine, was a grave one as you were juggling, as you mentioned, the actual recounting of the situation versus the history that you were very, very meticulously combing through and verifying and having validated by historians, by museums. So from that perspective, how did you create the overarching storyline from the beginning where, this is an idea based on this communication we received from this gentleman, and now we are flying him in to BC, and it's going to evolve into this amazing recounting of the story? Was it something that manifested through the conversation that you witnessed?
It's interesting. I'm very fortunate in my career, in my background, that I've met a lot of very, very impressive people. One of the people that I had the honor of becoming friends with was a gentleman by the name of Peter Jennings. Peter Jennings was ABC News broadcaster out of New York, and he came to Vancouver. We had a nice dinner, and all evening, all he did was ask me questions.
Yeah.
And he has been with world leaders, presidents, flown around the world. He's this, there's like 3 main networks, and he's one of the main guys in the United States, reporting the news. And what he was saying to me was, stay curious. So when you're interviewing someone, stay curious. And your interviewee is always going to give you like a short snippet of something. You need to dig. You need to go deeper. And when it gets to a point where they're pushing back, you still need to go deeper and kind of break through. And so I'm not a professional interviewer. I'm not a professional author. I never intended to write a book. So this wasn't part of my journey, but I remembered what Peter had said, stay curious. So when I was interviewing them, I wouldn't let them off the hook. And I wanted to go right back to the very beginning. And it was like, literally, where were you born? Tell me about your mother. Tell me about your father. In Dad's story, it was amazing because we got some of the information, but because of his dementia, he really couldn't remember. And when we were filming Leo's journey inside Hungary, when we went to his home in Baragova and we found his house, and the neighbors started coming out and they were all conversing and the cameras were getting B-roll. And he still had his microphone on. And they're speaking in this dialect of Hungarian. And they're going through all these conversations and everything else. And then I said, well, Dad, what did they say? It was nothing. It has nothing to do with the Auschwitz. It has nothing to do with the story. And for him, there was nothing going on. And I pushed him on it. I kept pushing on him. It's like, there's nothing going. There's nothing to say. He wouldn't say. He just talked about, he was a neighbor. That was all, right? So years later, I hired an interpreter. I had to find an interpreter that spoke that dialect of Hungarian. And I gave him all this B-roll. And they started, when we started seeing what they were talking about, they were talking about, a Yitzhak down the street who was the butcher, and another friend that used to live around the block, and he would play soccer, and that these people were builders, and there was a brothel at the end of the street in the little Mesa Castle right beside the candy store, and they're all talking about all of these other people in the neighborhood, which is the color of what that time was like. So he didn't see it important as it related to his story, but it was really valuable to start digging into that story, to be able to build the color of that moment, of what was it like to live in that neighborhood. Yes. And with Kalman, I just went back to the beginning, and I was blessed because he was a storyteller. He would go off on a tangent, and I'd get an hour of him just talking about his father, talking about his mother, growing up with his family, taking a trip to a wedding in the middle of winter where his uncle fell in the water and his dad went in to rescue him and he got tuberculosis and he died. They were then shipped off to another grandfather of the mother, but the mother's father didn't want anything to do with them because he was just newlywed. And so they had to go to the father's father, a grandfather. And so he took them in. Is this just all this kind of backstory that made it colorful?
Right.
And, and I would ask Kalman deeper questions. And he would go, what do you think? This is what happened. So it's like, I know. I don't know. I'm not a historian. I don't understand it. Explain it to me. Right. And it was a matter of trying to find the moments that were the intimate moments, the relationship with his mother, the relationship with his sister, his brother, and how his brother was older than him and went to a much harder religious school than he was going to. He was getting off easy, and so you have a little bit of tension going on between the older brother and the younger brother, and the differences between the sister and the brother and the twins. And so there was a moment when Kalman would be at the table after school having a piece of lemon poppy seed cake with his sister, and he loved lemon poppy seed cake. Okay, this was like, and he made a big deal about the story, and I'm listening to it. I'm going, okay, it's enough with the poppy seed cake. I get it. He loved poppy seed cake, and his mother would bake it and like this, and and so I let him go on and on and on, and I learned the lesson because later on, inside the guard shack, during Christmas, they had a big feast. And at the end of the evening, the boys clear all the scraps off the plates of the guards. They go back into the storage room, and they're not throwing it in the garbage. They're starving to death, and they're taking the scraps off of these plates, and they're taking it back to the barrack where he's sharing it with his uncle, who's a dwarf, which is a whole other story. He's like Yoda, this wise uncle, a dwarf uncle that was in the barrack with him. And then he would throw scraps over to his sister over the fence. They take a rock, they put it in some cement paper and bundle it all together and divvy it all up, and then throw some over the fence to the women's camp where his sister would meet him. And on that particular day inside the guard shack, as he was clearing the scraps off, he came across a full piece of lemon poppy seed cake.
Wow. What a full circle moment.
The serendipity of the things that were happening to this boy were just incredible. And I'm going, wow. It's like, I couldn't write that.
Right.
I couldn't make that up. Another quick story. There's so many unbelievable things happening. So Kalman arrives to Auschwitz. He's 14 years old. They've taken him in. They've shaved him. They've taken his new clothes off of what he was wearing, given him all these old torn rags, put him in that, took him to the barrack, and they said, this is where you will stay. Again, he's this religious boy. He doesn't know what's going on. He opens the door to walk in this barrack, and there are people dying. There's the walking skeletons. There's the smell, is just overwhelming. And then out of nowhere, this little boy starts walking up to him. And the boy, as he gets closer, Kalman notices the boy is wrinkled and he's wearing glasses. It's not a boy, it's a dwarf. And the boy comes up to him and he says, where do you come from? And he says, well, we just arrived with my mother and my grandfather, and they brought me here, and they said, this is where I'm supposed to be. And the dwarf takes him by the hand. He says, yes, this is where you're supposed to be. He says, what's your name? He says, my name is Kalman. And so he's walking Kalman into the barrack, into one of the lower bunks, because he's a dwarf. He can't get up to the higher ones. He sit on the lower bunk. And the dwarf starts telling him that you will be with me. I will look out for you. Every morning at 5 a.m., the capo comes, and they're very brutal, so you have to listen to them. And Kalman interrupts him and he says, what's your name? And the dwarf says, my name is Ludovic Feld. You can call me Lioche. And the dwarf then continues on, you must get up, and we have roll call every morning. We have to go outside. And Kalman stops him. He says, Feld. He said, I had an uncle named Feld. He married my crazy aunt. And the dwarf leans back. He looks at me. He says, that's my younger brother, Yitzhak. The dwarf's his uncle.
That is just, like you said, you can't write.
I can't write this. And then the dwarf is also an artist, and he is one of Mengele's artists. Mengele would bring him into his office and make him draw portraits of himself, and he would offer him a cigarette. And today in Slovakia, there is a statue of Ludovic Feld and a museum with his artwork, which is also represented in the Metropolitan Museum in New York of like Holocaust artwork. And Ludovic Feld is this famous dwarf artist that turns out to be his uncle. And in the book, I've got images of him. And what's really interesting is that when you look closely at the images that Ludovic has drawn, he draws himself into the images. So it's kind of like finding Waldo. So if you're looking close at the artwork that he draws, he's drawing this horrific scene, and then there's a window in the barrack, and you can see a little picture of him in the corner as he's watching what's going on.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
You can't make this up.
You can't. You can't make it up.
So back to your original question.
Yeah.
I started at the beginning and I wanted to go to the very end. Okay. What happened, and Simon was a great help. Let's talk about Tellwell for a moment. So I have all this information. I've written down the story, and between me and Simon, we would go back and forth, and he would challenge me. And what about this? What about that? And I had preconceived ideas of how I felt it should look.
Right.
And it was just a matter of Simon opening up my mind, and we came to this understanding. It's like, you know what? It would be better if, rather than telling your father's story, not knowing who Kalman is, and then telling Kalman's story, let's interweave them together. Let's tell them in a chronological order. So we're hearing Dad, then Kalman, then Dad, then Kalman, then, and so we're hearing what's happening to Kalman, and then we're finding out what's happening to Leopold at the same time.
Right.
And then I added in Mengele. So I added in Mengele in the sense of the context of third person.
Right.
I didn't say it from his point of view. I wasn't telling him as this horrific doctor. I was talking about Mengele as a young boy, as a young man, driving around in his fancy car with the girls and, and going to school and, wanting to get into being a dentist, but there wasn't enough money in it. And then finding Otmar von Verschuur and becoming more interested in the eugenics and this program, how he ended up in Auschwitz. So now we're following the three of these boys. And then I started adding the footnotes of the historical footnotes. So we're following these three young people, and then we're hearing the historical overview of how to frame it. And it became a natural evolution. It's kind of like, in Star Wars, let the Force be with you. Right? It wasn't my responsibility to write this story as much as it was a matter of letting the story tell itself and helping to guide it and looking for the opportunities where I'm going. There's moments where I could sit there and say, okay, these moments need to be more accentuated, and I can do that by moving this up here and moving this down here, and trying to find that presentation that leads the reader more into the adventure, the challenges, the fears, the hopes of what they were experiencing. Right?
Speaking about challenges, were there any difficulties that you experienced in the process of humanizing somebody who was responsible for such atrocities? You're talking about the writing in third person and speaking about Mengele's hopes and dreams and where he started in childhood. Was it a challenge for you to explore that narrative and that humanness in him?
No, I didn't find it as a challenge. I just found it, for me, is that it's a character arc. The more I found out about Mengele, the more that was interpreted. It was really interesting because when you read all the different historical documentation about Mengele, there's still information coming out. When you find out that this is just a regular kid that was in school and this is what he wanted to be, and the dehumanization of one other race versus their race. And there was a whole thing going on in Germany. Doctors were not there for your benefit and your health. They were there to build the health of the German population.
Right.
So if Uncle Fritz had a club foot, they wanted Uncle Fritz gone. Right. And they asked the children at the school to come home and say, hey, are any of your parents going through some medical challenges? Tell us about your family. And then the doctors would pay a visit to the family and say, hey, Uncle Fritz, you're coming with us. So I just found the whole thing fascinating as you see how people form their ideas and where that would take them to the ability to take a child and brutally murder a child, in your bare hands. Is like you're thinking that this person is like this unworldly monster. No, they're human beings.
Right.
They're I'm not going to say they're normal people, because what's normal?
Mm.
But they're just people who have these belief systems. If you're eating steak, you've killed a cow.
Right.
Right. My favorite commercials are those where it's like farm to table and they said, "What would you like for dinner?" "Oh, I'll have the barbecued ribs." And they said, "Okay, come on with me, take you into the back room, put an apron on you, and here's the pig. You're going to kill the pig, you're going to gut it, you're going to clean it, and you're going to put it on the barbecue, and you're going to bring it to your table." Farm to table. That's what
Hmm.
that is. People see that and they go, "I could never do that." But meanwhile,
Right.
you're eating the ribs. So in the scenario of understanding, how does that person get to kill that animal? And
Mm.
how could somebody brutally, murder that animal
Mm.
and make it food? How does somebody get to the point where they could murder that baby or murder that human? Right? It's the greater good of we're going to cleanse our society of those less human people. We
Mm.
need to do that for the greater good.
Mm.
And they're indoctrinated into this belief system. They actually believe it. And that's the challenge we face, is that,
Right.
again, it comes back to critical thinking. Does that make sense?
Right.
Should we be doing that? Right? I mean, when you look at parts of the world where they're still living in the Middle Ages,
Right.
the way
Yeah.
that they treat the women, the women's rights around the world, the fact that we're still living in an era where human trafficking and the things that are happening in some of these other countries around the world, and we're
Hmm.
going, oh, it's 2025. It doesn't matter. You still have evil people, and they're people.
Absolutely.
So when you make Mengele a monster and you place him up here and you say he was like one of a kind, he was this monster. Yeah, he was a monster, but he was still a human being who was indoctrinated into a belief system and followed at the time what the norm was for that government, what the norm was for those people at that time. And he just believed it. So for me, it was a matter of not making him into a monster, just telling his story and being as clear as I could on, who he was, what he wanted, how he ended up in Auschwitz, how he escaped from Auschwitz, how he was protected by his family, what happened to him down the road.
Right.
And I let their voices tell the story.
Given the sensitive nature of your subject matter, I would love to chat a little bit about the importance of capturing historical moments in history and maybe any advice that you might have for another author or filmmaker or somebody who feels compelled to something that is historically impactful in the way that you have.
I felt an enormous responsibility. I felt what I have here is a story that comes from a place that the world has never seen. They understand Auschwitz, they understand the ramps, they understand the mass murder of 6 million or 1.1 million people inside Auschwitz in the gas chambers. But there's a few movies out there that take you deep inside to understand, the actual people. So I felt I was responsible to tell their stories clearly as possible. The
Mm.
stories of suffering, stories of resilience, stories of humanity. And so I would spend hours on a single line. Like, I'm listening to what Kalman is saying, and I'm trying, because they're speaking in Hebrew, English, Hungarian, Polish, Czech, German, Russian. They have all these different languages and all these different euphemisms that they would use when they were telling their story. And I needed to kind of look at it and say, okay, how do I relate what he's saying and take the nuance that some people won't understand? If it's Jewish humor,
Right.
you might not get that,
Right.
right? And so I'm careful not to change what his statement was. And it was a lot of time and energy. And sometimes I had to take moments to stop, take a moment, step back, leave it for a week or two, come back, and then read it through. I'd have to go back to the archival tapes and listen to the story, watch him tell the story, watch his eyes and, the interview footage over and over again. So it's important that you respect your person that you're interviewing and not take over I mean, if you're doing fiction and you're doing historical, whatever, you can do whatever you want to that character. But when you're interviewing someone with a story like this, it's critical that you honor their memory, you ensure their dignity. I'm not exploiting any of their emotions. I'm just trying to capture the essence of what they're saying and ensure that it's represented on the page, that when you read it, you feel like you know Kalman. You can hear his voice. And it was really special because when people were reading and telling me about it, they could hear the difference between my dad, Leopold, who was just very dogmatic, and very clear, very short. Like Dad would say one line about August 2nd, 1944, where they eliminated the gypsy camp. That was it. That was all he would say, right? He spoke very few words. Kalman would go, we could hear the noise from the other camp and the trucks were pulling up. We could hear some of the screaming. I asked Leopold, what's going on? Leopold is saying, they're liquidating the gypsy camp. I didn't know what that word meant, right? And everybody in the barrack got up and we all started going outside and we could see the lights and the Germans and they were locking down the gypsy camp and they were barricading them in and they're coming into each barrack one by one and they're starting to take the old men and the women and the children out. They gotten rid of the men long time ago. And he just goes into this long story. And I'm thinking, my God, my dad only said one line and Kalman's talking for 4 pages. It's not balanced.
Right.
How do I balance this? And then I'm going, no, you don't.
Right.
It's
authentic to...
Dad is one line.
Yes.
And Kalman spoke and was very loquacious. So one of the people that gave me a review, he said, this story was told like Tolstoy. I'm going, seriously? He says, because it's authentic. Right. He said, I was just thinking, going, I'm like Tolstoy. That's great. Like,
can I put that on my cover?
Absolutely. I want to, And so the idea being is that because it was authentic, because it wasn't embellished, because it wasn't, I didn't take it and try to do something with it more than what it really was. And so it was extremely emotional, very challenging, because you felt like you wanted to do something with it. You wanted to change a word here, or you wanted this moment was, if they had just done this, or if I could just do that. And no, you can't. You have to honor the moment of what those people, is their story, not my story that I'm trying to tell. So be emotionally sensitive towards your subjects and be respectful and just try to capture the essence, the nuances of what these people are saying. And because there's a lot of unseen things, even in their pauses. In music, they say that the real story is in the pauses. Right. Like if you're listening to Schindler's List and you hear that moment, that breath, and then the violin and how it comes in, as that pause creates that drama. Right. That's about to come.
I have just a couple more questions here, including our final segment, which is called The Plot Thickens. And that is a user-submitted question segment. So for those who are listening, please be sure to follow us on Instagram at Tellwell Publishing. I always put a call out on Instagram and ask people to submit their questions for whoever the guest is of the podcast that we are having. So there are many motivating factors for a lot of authors, and it looks different for authors depending on what they hope to kind of gain from their publishing journey. What would you say was the greatest motivator for you writing this story? And after everything that you have personally experienced and accomplished, how do you hope your own legacy is remembered?
I stumbled upon a story that the world didn't know, that people need to know, that it's a story from inside the world's largest, most efficient killing machine that's ever been created. And this is the inside eyewitness story from inside the guard shack of the day-to-day operations of the killing machine.
Right.
I have that story.
Right.
How do I not tell it? How do I not come out to the world? I would feel guilty by withholding information. As Elie Wiesel said, to listen to a witness is to become a witness.
Mm, right.
So I've now listened to these witnesses, I have this story, so I am now a witness.
Mm,
And anybody that reads the book is a witness. You've learned that story. How could you possibly not tell the world about how industrial killing machine not simply just came about, but how these people who were the guards in this SS guard shack could be celebrating during Christmas, singing songs, getting drunk, having a big meal and festivities, and dancing and singing inside an SS guard shack where, 200 feet away from you was a crematorium churning out flames of blood and flesh and, so close to you. And Dad and Kalman are watching these guards have a Christmas party
right.
inside the death camp. And to understand that and go, how could anybody kind of go through that? And then the next day be out there brutally killing people again.
Mm,
And they look so normal. They look so happy, celebrating and eating and drinking and having festivities and laughing and poking fun at each other. And it was just like a frat party. And so where have you ever heard that before?
mm,
Where has the world ever known the story of what it was like to be in the laboratory with all these doctors who were experimenting on you and treating you like lab rats and putting you through these experiments where Kalman takes you inside, right to the prodding, the measurements and the exercises and the injections of what they were doing. And, Dad was so close to Mengele that you could smell his breath. You were that close to this man, knowing he'd killed your parents, knowing he was the guy on the ramp that was deciding who would die and who would live. Most died.
right.
And now you're standing naked in front of this man, and he's literally 3 or 4 inches from your face. There were 3,000 twins that went in. You have less than 120 that survived. And out of those 120 to survive, most don't speak English. Most don't want to relive it. Most don't want to go back to those moments. And there's just a very, very few that were able to say, this is what was going on there.
Absolutely.
So
Wow.
I'm less than like 5 or 6 people in the world that have an opportunity to tell you this story.
Mm,
That to me is, it's a burden and it's a blessing.
definitely.
I'm 67 years old and I've been working on this book for 5.5 years and it's now starting to get some traction.
Yeah.
We have a couple of international publishers, and this is a book that needs to be in Germany, in Hungary, in Poland, in Israel, in South America, in Russia. It needs to be a story that the world can understand what was going on in the close quarters of Auschwitz-Birkenau. So throughout that 5.5 years, back in 2015, I had bypass surgery. I had a triple bypass. Health is reasonably good. But I always kind of thought, geez, wouldn't it suck if I died just before I got this published?
Right.
Because it would sit on my computer with all that information and nobody else would know with the exception of maybe Simon, right? To be able to go and say, okay, well, the author's gone now and the book's not finished. And what do we do with this? Right? How do we get the story out? And so for me, having finished the book has been a part of my history that now I feel that if I do pass, not that I want to, got a lot more to do, but it's been done, it's out, it's on the shelf, and there's a lot of people in the world that now know about this. I have in the UK, I have a lot of support and different people that are going to be telling the story. I'm appearing at a number of different festivals coming up, telling the story. And so I'm trying to get to that tipping point where this book will take off and become something. And people say, oh, well, you're about the money or, you want to sell the book and, marketing the book, whatever. I said, this isn't about the money. It's about getting into the educational system. It's about getting the story out. As I say, we have, my next goal is that we have 2 international publishers knocking on the door right now and they want worldwide rights. and which is very exciting.
It's incredible.
We have Kirkus Reviews, which is a huge magazine in the States. It's kind of like the Hollywood Reporter to the film industry. Kirkus Reviews is to the book industry. And in their April 15th issue, they're going to be featuring the book. Again, a massive, massive accomplishment. So my legacy will be that I was able to actually get this story out. My father was always surprised after we made Leo's journey because he didn't feel his story was important, because he said that others suffered more than I did. There were other people that were more brutalized. So he was actually had it pretty good, other than a few injections that he got from Mengele. He was protected because he was a Mengele twin. Nobody could really, brutalize him or murder him. Only Mengele could kill him.
Right, right.
So another guard couldn't kill him. They could beat him. They couldn't kill him. Right? So he felt that he was a little more fortunate than the other families and the other people that were brutalized and murdered and what they went through. And it was interesting because, in fact, it's something that his story became important, it's always been important, is because he was able to stand there as a witness. And same with Kalman. Kalman chose to remember. He chose to document it. He chose to keep a diary. He wanted to remember everything. Right. And it shows in the book. He remembered the guards' names, dates, times, places, which I was able to verify. Like when you go through the book, you have the chronological order. It's because Kalman gave me dates and times and places that I could verify through the book. And people say, well, that's a little odd that you would know it was on that date at that time. Well, I know when that transport came in from Berehova. I know that when Dad was in for his showers, because when you read about the Ovitz family, which was a family of 7 dwarves, Mengele had his own dwarves, 7 dwarves. He felt that he was just like Disney.
Oh, my word.
You can't make this up.
You can't.
Mengele had 7 dwarves. 2 of the male dwarves were in the barracks with my dad and Kalman. So when you read their story and you get their dates, you're able to cross-reference this. When you read about Nishli, you cross-reference this. So I was able to, get all these stories. And now the legacy is, it's not my legacy so much as it is Kalman and Leopold's legacy. I feel like I'm part of the legacy because I'm trying to amplify their story. Right. But they were the ones that told me the story. They're the ones that came and relived these moments. So my legacy is allowing this story and helping this story of what Kalman and Leopold went through, so their legacy will live on. And I feel a great honor that I was able to help play a small role in facilitating this and getting this out there to the world.
This has been just such an enlightening and powerful conversation, and I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. I just think that the perspective and the realization that this is how historical nonfiction, for example, comes to be is just a really, really insightful conversation.
You asked me at the very beginning, what's my background? So my background of corporate event management, storytelling, taking my clients' stories and putting them on the big screen. I was the guy that introduced Chris Hadfield to William Shatner on stage. I produced shows with Andrea Bocelli in Venice, Italy, and surprised the audience. We would have Malcolm Gladwell from the New Yorker and present him on stage telling, his stories. Wow. Now the film. And so my whole career has been about storytelling. If I told you I was going to produce a musical about the pogroms of Russia during the turn of the century, when the Russians were brutalizing the shtetls of the Jewish people during the turn of the century, literally coming in and murdering these people. And I was going to make a musical about that. What would the musical be called? Fiddler on the Roof.
Right.
It's how you frame it.
Right.
So I've got this music, which is just, as I say, it's like Les Miserables, Phantom of the Opera, 60-piece orchestra, 200-piece choir. And I've started editing Kalman and Leopold to that music.
My goodness.
With the idea that I want to be able to create a theatrical production of Kalman and Leopold. So the idea is to get the story out is it isn't just the book. It's also having perhaps a theatrical production. It's also having a mini series, whether it be Netflix or whatever. So you're coming from an infotainment angle to try and educate people on this piece of history. If I went to you and said, I'm going to teach you a history lesson about what happened in Auschwitz and all the 6 million that died, you're going to go, oh, okay, yeah, there's Rwanda and there's all these other things, and it's all so terrible. If I come to you and I make Schindler's List, which is infotainment, you watch the film and you learn something. So if I can engage people to learn something about the adventure that these two boys went on, rather than it's another Holocaust story, rather than, it's, Jewish history. This is beyond Jewish history. This is the first industrial killing center in the world by evil people, right? There were a lot of non-Jews that died there as well.
Absolutely.
So that's kind of like the bigger scope. That I'm hoping will truly be my legacy, is to be able to create these other programs that come from their story.
So we think of how people consume content, and they consume it in ways that resonate with them as well. Not everybody is a reader. Not everybody is a movie buff. Not everybody is interested in going to the theater and watching a musical. But if you make the information widely available in all of these different mediums, suddenly you're reaching such a wider audience, and therefore the impact is that much greater.
And they're learning.
Yes.
And they're learning. They're seeing a part of history that they don't want to be in a class being spoon-fed. And I went through the same thing with my school teacher when they did this or they cut us off from that. When you watch Harry Potter or you watch some of these films and you see how they post on the bulletin board in the hallway that you're not allowed to carry your wand, you're not allowed to do magic, you're not allowed to wear your cape, you're not allowed to do this anymore. They're slowly taking away all of your rights. One by one, it's death by 1,000 slices. They slowly take away. And this is what's happening. If you're on the way to the airport and the customs guard says to you, please stand over here. What do? You stand over there. Yeah. They say, please go into this room. We're just going to do we have a few more questions for you. You go into the room. They lock the door from the outside. You're now in this room. 2 big guards come in and they say, please come with us. What do? It's like, This is what happened to these people. Today, people are going, how could they ever have walked into the gas chambers? This tells you how. It's a slow death by 1,000 cuts that led these ignorant religious people into these gas chambers, and where you hang your coat on a numbered hook and you put your shoes down here and you're going to go in, and then afterwards you're going to go to work in the fields. This is how we learn. Do your critical thinking, figure it out on your own, research your leaders that you think that, they're for or against, do not listen to friends and opinions. Do not listen to some of the mass media. Get the facts, critical thinking.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Richard. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to our next conversation. For those listening, please be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and check us out on YouTube as well. We'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.